The moment I remember most clearly isn't the applause. It isn't the Admiral's handshake or the gold-lettered program or the weight of the medal in my hands. What I remember most clearly is my father's face the exact second everything he believed about me stopped being true. His mouth was open. Nothing came out. And for the first time in my 40 years on this earth, I watched the man who had spent my entire childhood looking past me finally, completely, see me. But that moment didn't begin in Washington. That moment began 37 years earlier in a small house on the south side of Atlanta, in a kitchen that smelled like instant coffee and old wood, where a little girl carried a perfect spelling test down the hallway and offered it to her father like a gift. He glanced at it for 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Good job, Diana. Then he looked back at my brother. How was practice, Damon? I stood there holding the paper, waiting. He never looked back. I need to tell you something before I go any further. I almost didn't share this story, not because it's too painful. I've made a certain peace with the painful parts. I almost didn't share it because I know how easy it is to hear a story like this and walk away thinking it's about revenge. It isn't. This is a story about what happens when you stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself instead. It took me most of my life to understand the difference. I hope it takes you less. My name is Diana Reeves. I grew up in the Lakewood neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, in a house that was always clean, always financially stable, and almost always emotionally lopsided. My father, Gerald Reeves, was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that from the start, because the easiest version of this story turns him into a villain, and he wasn't one. He was something more complicated than a villain. He was a man who had inherited a very specific idea about what mattered, and my brother Damon fit that idea perfectly, and I did not. Damon was 4 years younger than me. Dark eyes, easy smile, natural athlete. From the moment he could walk, my father saw his own future in that boy. Basketball trophies, college scholarships, maybe professional. Dad talked about it the way other men talk about religion, with complete certainty, with sacrifice, with daily devotion. He drove Damon to pre-dawn practices. He worked overtime to pay for elite travel leagues. He memorized Damon's shooting percentages the way other fathers memorize Bible verses. And none of that was wrong. The problem was the wall in our living room. Damon's trophies. Damon's photographs. Damon's certificates framed and hung at eye level. I would walk through that room sometimes and try to find myself. There was nothing, not one frame, not one ribbon, nothing. I spent most of elementary school believing this was a problem I could solve. If I just worked harder, if I just achieved something bigger. Children do that, they absorb the problem as if it belongs to them. I brought home academic awards. I made the honor roll every semester. I won a regional essay competition in 5th grade. Each time, my father said something kind and brief and then moved on. The attention never lasted. The attention always went somewhere else. I learned to stop expecting it, but I never learned to stop wanting it. The person who filled that gap was my mother, Lorraine Reeves. If you've ever had someone in your life who seemed to see you more clearly than you saw yourself, you know what she was to me. She wasn't loud. She wasn't the parent who organized fundraisers or led the school PTA. She was quiet in the way rivers are quiet, consistently moving, deeply powerful, essential. She knew when I was hurting before I said a word. She knew what I needed before I could name it. And she believed in me not as a potential achievement, but as a complete human being, right now, exactly as I was. I remember one evening when I was 11 or 12. Damon had scored 22 points in a tournament game, and the drive home from that gym felt like a ticker tape parade. Dad couldn't stop talking. Mom sat quietly in the front seat. I sat in the back, watching the city lights slide past the window, pressing my cheek against the glass, trying to make myself smaller than I already felt. When we got home, Mom followed me upstairs without saying anything. She sat on the edge of my bed. We were quiet for a while. Then she said, "You're somewhere far away right now." I said I was fine. She said, "I know you well enough to know that isn't true." And something in the certainty of that she knew me that well made the tears come before I could stop them. She didn't try to fix my father that night. She never did that. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. What she said instead was this: "Diana, I need you to understand something. The way someone treats you is never the final word on your worth. It's only a reflection of what they can see." I was 12. I didn't fully understand it. But I kept those words somewhere safe in the back of my mind, the way you keep a tool you don't know how to use yet. Honestly, thinking about that moment right now, I get a little tight in the chest. Because if you have ever sat in a room full of people and felt completely invisible, you know exactly what that bedroom felt like. You know the particular ache of wanting to be known by someone who keeps looking past you. It is one of the loneliest feelings a human being can carry, and the fact that my mother saw it, named it, and refused to let me disappear into it. I didn't know yet how much I would need that memory later. Life moved forward the way it does. I got older. The pattern stayed the same. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped competing for my father's attention. Not because I stopped caring, but because I ran out of strategies. I threw myself into academics instead, not to impress anyone, but because studying felt like the one place where effort translated directly into result. No favoritism, no politics. You did the work, you got the grade. I needed that clarity. And then came the thing nobody was ready for. My mother got sick. She had been tired for a few months before anyone named it. Then the doctor appointments started. Then the specialist visits. Then the word cancer sat down at our kitchen table and didn't leave. I was 16. I watched the strongest person I knew grow slower, quieter, thinner. I watched my father become frantic in his helplessness. I watched Damon bury himself in basketball because he didn't know what else to do. And I sat beside her hospital bed as often as they would let me, holding her hand, talking about everything and nothing, pretending I wasn't memorizing her face. One evening she held my hand and said, "Diana, I need you to promise me something." I told her I was listening. She said, "Don't you ever let someone else's opinion become your ceiling?" I told her I promised. She smiled that quiet, certain smile, and then she whispered something I have carried in my body every single day since. "They will see you. Maybe not today, but they will see you." At the time, I thought she meant my father. She passed away 3 months before I graduated high school. I was 17 years old. The morning of her funeral, the house was full of people, full of flowers, full of the particular noise of grief. And I felt like a glass with a crack running through it, holding together for now, but barely. At the graveside I kept thinking, she was the only person in my family who was paying attention. And now she was gone. I did not know how to do this without her. I found her letter 6 weeks later. It was tucked inside an old cedar box she kept on the top shelf of her closet, a box I had been given permission to go through. The envelope had my name on it in her handwriting. She had folded the letter many times, as if she'd written it and reread it and folded it again more than once before deciding where to leave it. The paper smelled faintly like her. I had to put it down before I could finish reading it because my hands were shaking too hard. But there was one line I read clearly on the first try. "You are not an afterthought. You were never an afterthought. Act accordingly." I read those words until I knew them the way I knew my own heartbeat. Graduation arrived. I walked across a stage in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and cheap streamers. Families were cheering all around me. I received my diploma, smiled at the camera, and in the exact moment I turned to walk off the stage, I looked for her in the crowd. For just a second, my eyes went to where she would have been sitting. There was only an empty chair beside my father. I finished walking and did not cry. I had been practicing that. College was not going to be handed to me. Dad had made that much clear, not cruelly, not intentionally, simply by where the family's resources continued going. Damon's basketball program was expensive. Equipment, fees, recruiting visits, trainer costs. There was always a reason the money was committed elsewhere. So I sat at the kitchen table every night with scholarship applications stacked around me like a small city. I applied for everything. academic merit, leadership programs, community service grants, essay competitions. My father walked past one evening, looked at the papers, and said, "That's probably your best bet." Not unkind, not encouraging, just honest in the flattest possible way. I almost stopped. I didn't stop. Several months later, I had enough financial aid to attend Georgia State University. Not because anyone handed me a path, because I had built one out of whatever materials were available. I worked 2 jobs through most of my undergraduate years: early morning shifts at a hospital cafeteria, late evening shifts waitressing on the east side. I learned how to make $30 last a week. I learned how to study on 4 hours of sleep. I learned something that I have come to believe is one of the most useful skills a human being can develop: how to keep going when no one is watching and no one is clapping. That sounds simple. It isn't. Most people only know how to sustain effort when they feel supported. When the feedback loop is positive and the encouragement is coming and someone tells them they're doing well. I had none of that. What I had instead was my mother's letter, which I had folded and tucked into every wallet I carried from the age of 17 until today. And somehow that was enough. Not comfortable, not easy, enough. By my junior year, I was looking at a future and not finding a shape for it. I was pre-law but uncertain. I was managing fine academically, but something felt unresolved, like I was still waiting for a room where the rules were clear, and the results were fair, and nobody gave you extra credit for being someone's son. A recruiter table outside the student union changed the direction of everything. The woman at the table asked me one question: "What are you looking for?" I thought about it longer than she probably expected. Then I said, "Something I can earn on my own terms." She nodded and handed me a brochure. 2 months later, I was at officer candidate school. I am not going to romanticize military service. It is hard. It is exhausting. It asks things from you that you didn't know you had to give. But for me, for Diana Reeves from the south side of Atlanta, who had spent 22 years in a family where the scoring was never fair, the military felt like the first completely level floor I had ever stood on. Performance was visible. Expectations were stated. Nobody in my chain of command cared about my brother's jump shot. They cared what I could do. Not everyone was welcoming. There were officers early in my career who looked at me and quietly decided I was decorative. I noticed. I did not argue with them. I had learned long before that performance changes minds faster than protest ever does. So I performed. I studied harder than anyone expected. I volunteered for deployments. Others avoided. I mentored junior officers when it wasn't required and nobody was watching. I built a reputation the same way I had built everything else, slowly, without applause, one decision at a time. Years passed. Promotions came. Assignments in places I couldn't have pointed to on a map when I was 17. I served in a humanitarian response mission that I still think about: communities that had been leveled by a natural disaster, families with nothing, children sitting in the rubble of what used to be their homes. We worked for weeks without adequate sleep or resources, because people needed us and that was the job. I didn't know at the time that someone was watching closely enough to put that mission in a formal nomination. I was simply doing what I had always done: the work, whether anyone was looking or not. My father called occasionally during these years. The conversations were short and functional. He kept waiting for Michael, for Damon, to figure out what came after basketball. Damon's career had ended with a knee injury at 24, and watching my father try to rebuild hope around a son whose path had suddenly closed felt familiar in a painful way. He poured support and energy into helping Damon find a new direction. I watched from a distance and felt something I had not expected. Not envy, but clarity. The love was always there. It had simply been pointed in a direction that made no room for me. That understanding did not erase the hurt, but it helped me stop waiting for an apology that might never come. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday evening. I was home late after a 12-hour day. I brought in the mail without paying much attention. The return address was a government office in Washington, D.C. I assumed it was administrative. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table before I opened it. I read it 3 times. The letter informed me that I had been selected for a national recognition honoring distinguished military leadership and public service. The ceremony would take place in Washington, at the White House. I sat in my kitchen in complete silence for a very long time. Then I looked at the photograph of my mother. I keep on the windowsill, the one where she's sitting on the front porch of the old house, holding a coffee mug, smiling at whoever is behind the camera. I looked at her for a while. Then I said, out loud, to no one, and to her at the same time, "Mama, they saw me." I called my father the next morning. I told him what the letter said. There was a long pause. Then he said, "The White House?" I said yes. Another pause. "Well, that's something." Over the following days he called more than he had in years. He was excited about the ceremony, the prestige, the history of the building. He wanted to know if family members were invited. I said yes before I fully thought about it. He showed up to the airport with his invitation printed and laminated. He told the gate agent at check-in that we were going to the White House. She nodded politely. I looked at the ceiling. The flight to Washington was fine. The city when we arrived was beautiful, the monuments catching early morning light. The streets wide and formal, everything organized around the idea of significance. Our hotel was near the mall. That evening, Dad moved through the lobby as if he himself had been honored. He struck up conversations with strangers. He mentioned the White House ceremony 4 times in the span of an hour. I watched and felt the old familiar mixture of affection and exhaustion. The morning of the ceremony, I woke before 5. I stood at the hotel window and watched the city come to life below me. I wasn't nervous. I had spent decades being nervous about things that depended on other people's decisions. This was different. Whatever was about to happen, I had already done the work that brought me here. The outcome was settled. I was only going to go receive it. We dressed and took a car to the ceremony. As we pulled through the security perimeter, my father adjusted his jacket. He checked his invitation in his jacket pocket. Then he checked it again. When we joined the line of guests, military leaders, senior officials, decorated veterans, their families, he held his VIP pass with both hands, slightly raised, so it was visible. I noticed. I said nothing. We were nearly at the registration desk when he glanced sideways at me. A small smile. The same smile I had seen on 100 different days over 40 years. "You weren't invited." Quiet. Just between us. Just enough. I felt 17 again for exactly 1 second, standing in a kitchen, holding a spelling test, waiting. Then I felt 40. And I handed my invitation to the hostess. She scanned it. The scanner beeped. Her expression changed. She looked at the screen, looked at me, looked at the screen again. Then she turned toward a senior naval officer standing 20 feet away. Her voice was careful and controlled. "Admiral Chen. She's here." He moved immediately. Not after a moment. Immediately. Several officials near him straightened their posture as he crossed the room. He stopped directly in front of me. He was smiling. "Commander Reeves." He extended his hand. "It's an honor. We've been looking forward to this." I shook his hand. "Thank you, sir." He turned toward the entrance. "Please, come in. We've been waiting for you." I heard my father exhale behind me. "I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because I have thought about it hundreds of times since. Not with satisfaction. I want to be careful about that. There's a version of that moment that is about victory and revenge and making someone feel small. That's not what it was. What it was a 40-year truth becoming visible in a single gesture. The Admiral walking past my father and extending his hand to me was not a power move. It was simply the world correctly identifying who was in the room. And I had spent my entire life waiting for that correction to arrive. My father stood beside me as Admiral Chen guided us through the entrance. Senior officers recognized me by name. A woman I had served alongside in the disaster response greeted me warmly. A general shook my hand and said something kind about my mentorship work. At each exchange, my father's expression shifted slightly from polite confusion to something closer to recalibration, to something I had almost never seen on his face before. He leaned close at one point and said quietly, How do all these people know you? I looked at him. We've worked together, Dad. He nodded slowly, like a man trying to absorb 10 years of information in a single hallway. We entered the main hall. Flags, military banners, rows of carefully arranged seating under ceilings that carried the weight of history. An usher appeared at my elbow. Commander Reeves, right this way. She guided me forward past the family seating, past the general guest section, all the way to the front. My father stopped walking. Diana, what is this? I turned around. This is where they asked me to sit, Dad. He stood completely still. The ceremony began. Speeches, recognitions. The room was full and attentive and formal in the way that large rooms become when everyone inside them understands that something real is happening. Then my name was announced. The applause that followed was immediate and full. I walked to the stage and I had one thought, clear and simple. She was right. Not about the award. Not about the White House. About the fundamental thing that being seen was possible. That it would come. She had believed that when I had no evidence for it. And here was the evidence. 23 years late. Complete. The citation was read. Leadership under pressure. Years of service. Mentorship programs. Humanitarian contributions. Each line sounded like it belonged to someone I had been becoming slowly, without fully noticing. After the presentation, as I returned to my seat, Admiral Chen leaned slightly toward me. Your mother would be proud of you today, Commander. I do not know how he knew about her. Perhaps he had read my file. Perhaps someone had told him. It didn't matter. The words hit somewhere deeper than the recognition, deeper than the applause. Because she would have been, and she never got to see it. And I felt both things at the same time, the fullness of the moment and the grief of the absence, and somehow they fit together without contradiction. After the ceremony ended, I spent an hour in conversation with people I admired and respected. My father stood at the edge of the room. Quiet. That alone was remarkable. He was not a quiet man, but he was quiet now. Eventually the crowd thinned. Admiral Chen stopped by one final time. He shook my hand. Then he looked at my father with a warm, easy smile. You raised an extraordinary woman. My father looked at the floor. He said nothing. The Admiral moved on. We stood there together in a room that had been full of history all day, and for a moment it was just the two of us, surrounded by people and somehow entirely alone. He cleared his throat. I didn't know. His voice was lower than usual. I said, "What didn't you know?" He gave a short, sad laugh. Any of it. For years I had rehearsed what I might say to him in a moment like this. I had imagined anger. I had imagined a speech. What I actually felt was tired and tender, and something close to pity. I know you didn't, I said, and I meant it. We walked outside into afternoon light. He suggested a walk. We found a quiet path and followed it in silence for a while. Then he stopped. Diana, I owe you an apology. The words came out stiff, like something being carried in a clenched fist, and finally released. I waited. He stared at the ground. I had this idea. About sons and daughters, about what each was supposed to be. He shook his head slowly. I kept waiting for Damon to become what I imagined. And while I was doing that, he paused. I missed who you already were. He swallowed. I remember your spelling test. 3rd grade. I remember your face when I looked away. The detail undid me slightly. I had believed for 30 years that he hadn't noticed. He had noticed. He had simply chosen not to hold it. That distinction is brutal in a way I am still sitting with. We kept walking. He stopped again near a small garden. Your mother knew, I said. She did. He nodded. She used to tell me, Gerald, one day you're going to see what that girl is built from. He looked toward the trees. I should have listened to her the first time she said it. We stood there in silence for a long moment. A flag moved in a light wind above us. Somewhere in the distance, the ordinary sounds of a city going about its afternoon. Finally, I looked at him. This man who had hurt me without intending to hurt me, who had failed me without meaning to fail me, who was standing in front of me now with his hands open and his face older than I remembered, and I made a choice. Forgiveness is not absolution. It does not rewrite history or pretend that damage was not real. What forgiveness does is refuse to let the past eat the future. My mother gave me too much for me to spend the rest of my life in anger about what my father couldn't give. Yeah, Dad, I said. We can move forward. His shoulders came down about an inch, and that was enough. The flight home was different. On the way to Washington, he had talked about the ceremony, the building, the prestige. On the way back, he talked about my mother. He told me things about her I hadn't known, small things, private things, moments between them that belonged to their marriage, and that he offered now like gifts he had been holding too long. At one point he said, quietly, "You know what I remember most about the way she looked at you?" I asked what. He said, "She looked at you like she already knew how this story was going to end." I didn't say anything, but I held that sentence the way I had held her letter for 23 years. A few months later, he called and asked if I would drive down to the cemetery with him. I said yes. We went on a Saturday morning, bright and cool, and we brought white flowers, the same kind she used to plant every spring, along the front porch. We stood at the headstone and were quiet for a while. Then my father reached into his jacket and took out something carefully folded. The White House ceremony program. He placed it gently next to the flowers. His voice was unsteady when he spoke. "You were right," he said to the headstone. "I should have listened." He stood there for a long time. I stood beside him. This story taught me something I want to leave with you before we're done. Success is not what makes people see you. The people who were always going to see you will see you early, the way my mother did. The people who couldn't see you, they will need something extraordinary to break through the certainty of what they already believe. And even then, even when that extraordinary thing arrives, the real work is not in the moment of being seen. The real work is in deciding what you're going to do with it. Whether you're going to make it about them, about the wound, the slight, the long overdue apology, or whether you're going to make it about the only person whose choices have always been yours to make, yourself. The mistake most people make is waiting for external validation before they begin, before they apply, before they try, before they believe that their effort has value. My mother understood something nobody else in that house did, that my worth was not conditional on my father's attention. It existed entirely independently of whether he was paying it. Act accordingly. Those were her words. 2 words. They are the best instruction I have ever received. If you've been in a room where someone looked through you like glass, maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe someone whose opinion you carried around like a stone in your chest, I want you to know that their limited vision is not your ceiling. You are not defined by what they failed to see. You are defined by what you chose to do while they were looking elsewhere. Here's the question I'd like you to sit with tonight. Is there something you have been waiting for permission to pursue? Permission that someone failed to give you, or withheld, or never thought to offer? Because that permission was always yours to give yourself. It always was. Before I go, drop a comment and tell me, 1, if you think Diana made the right call inviting her father to Washington, 2, if you think she should have gone alone, or 3, if you're still figuring out how you feel about it. I genuinely want to know. And tell me where you're watching, from what city, what time is it there right now? Have you ever had a moment where someone who overlooked you was finally forced to see you clearly? Tell me about it. These comments mean more than you know. If this story reached something in you, please consider subscribing. I share stories like this about resilience, about the long road to being seen, about what it means to forgive without forgetting, because I believe they matter, because I believe you matter. I'll see you in the next one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta, Georgia, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental.